Hello and welcome to Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. The topic of Russia's foreign policy towards Syria is quite contentious. It gets a lot of criticism in the media. And on this program today, we're going to see if it's justified. Joining me in London is Christian Benedict at Amnesty International. He's the UK campaign manager there. We have Wael Alji. He is a member of the Syrian National Council and Europe director of the Syrian Christians for Democracy organization. And here in the studio with me here in Moscow is Alexander Kuznetsov. He's a vice president of Geo-Arabica Center. Christian, if I go to you first, when we look at the problems in dealing, it's 2 years now going on, this conflict, this civil war. What does Syria need more of right now? Does it need more diplomacy or does it need more guns?
Ultimately, Syrian civilians need protection. That's where we would like the international community's debate to be in terms of how do they better protect civilians. And that seems to be missing.
Does that mean arming them?
Well,
let's be clear here. Because we have
Sure.
officials in France
Sure.
and in Britain saying they're opening to the idea of not respecting the embargo. Go ahead.
Sure, and they've been saying that for a long time, and Amnesty International have been saying back to them, what are the safeguards? Are you assessing the risks properly? How will this better protect civilians? It's for those countries that are thinking of potentially arming particular armed groups inside Syria to be able to answer those questions. Those questions haven't been answered adequately yet.
Okay, well, what do you think? More arms or more diplomacy?
Let me be honest with you. Syria is in a state of war. There is a regime that is continuously killing its people and constantly receiving unlimited support from its allies in Russia and Iran and China. On the other hand, we have people who want to defend themselves, to protect their children, to protect their properties, and they lack everything. They lack food, they lack medicines, they lack ammunition, they lack arms.
You're saying fuel the civil war. Fuel the civil war. I'm sorry, but that's what it sounds like.
No, I'm not saying fuel the civil war. It is actually Russia that is fueling the civil war by its continuous support to the Syrian regime.
Please, let me go to our third guest, and then we can do this, gentlemen. Alexander, jump in.
Of course, Syria needs much diplomacy and less arms because they are providing arms support for the rebels of the so-called Free Syrian Army and of the jihadist group, fuels the religious civil war in Syria. I want to say that Syrian war began as peaceful protests against the dictatorship, but now we have the full-scale religious civil war in this country. And even if the jihadists won the victory in Damascus, the civil war will not finish. It will continue as a civil war in Lebanon, for example.
Okay, Alex, let me ask you a question. So if Assad left today, for example, what would change on the ground? Anything? Yes. What would change?
Nothing will change if Assad will leave the power.
Okay, Christian, you want to react to that? If Assad left today, nothing would change on the ground. Go ahead.
Well, I suspect it would have a huge psychological impact on those people who have been demanding he leaves. And we've got to remember, as your guest in Russia just said, people rose up against core problems. This is not over the past 2 years. People rose up over core problems of poverty, of corruption, of repression, of the impunity of the regime. And they did that peacefully. We've got to remember it was the regime that opened fire on peaceful protesters. They were demanding change. So to characterize those people opposed to the current regime as somehow jihadis who want to chop everybody's heads off.
Do they exist?
Of course they do.
Do they exist?
Of course they do.
Of course they do. Let's be clear, they do.
Of course they do. But what I'm saying is to characterize everybody who is either anti-Assad or actually just wants an end to this suffering, this poverty, this grinding issue that is going on in Syria for decades, to characterize all them as somehow as jihadis is absolutely a gross misinterpretation of what's going on inside Syria.
Do you support forced regime change?
Well, Amnesty doesn't take a position on the use of force. What we're saying is those governments who are thinking of arming different armed groups need to ensure that safeguards are in place. It's for them to look at what the risk is and what impact that will have, not just within the country on civilians, but in the region as well.
Is Saudi Arabia and Qatar and all the rest of the Gulf countries, are they concerned about the use of force, giving them arms and training? I mean, everyone keeps talking about Russia, China, Iran, but where are the arms coming from?
Mainly from from the defectors. Don't forget that thousands and thousands of army officers and soldiers have defected, and those people brought their weapons and ammunition with them. And there are daily battles with the regime's forces. And when the Free Syrian Army personnel take control of one of the regime's units, then they will get all the weapons and the ammunition, and the cycle continues. Of course, there is some little supply from across the borders from Turkey and Iraq smuggling weapons, but this is very limited. The main source is coming from inside Syria.
Alexander, has diplomacy been given a real chance here? Because it seems, I look at Lavrov, the foreign minister here, and he's tirelessly going around the world trying to get some kind of negotiations, but not a lot of the rebel groups are not interested in that. They're not interested in talking.
I think the process in Syria is very complicated, and even in the rebel movement, we have some different groups. Now the strongest group is the group of so-called takfirists or jihadists. The Jabhat al-Nusra and some other groups.
But don't forget that these were created by the regime itself. It used to cultivate them in Syria and send them back to Iraq to kill civilians. These people were created by the regime itself.
I'm sorry, we don't speak about Iraq and about Iraq situation. We speak about modern present Syrian situation. And last December, I have been to Beirut, and very informed people from Hezbollah movement said to me that this jihadist group has more than 70% of the arms, and the secular rebels.
That's wrong. That's wrong.
Than 30% now.
That's wrong. You are using Hezbollah.
Well, go ahead. Everyone gets the same amount of time. Go ahead.
Just to repeat, don't forget that this is a regime that used to receive all the jihadists and the Al-Qaeda personnel from all over the world, train them in Syria and send them back to Iraq and Lebanon to destabilize the region. So now the Russians are talking as if those jihadists were created by the revolution, which not the situation. And I find it very strange that your guest in Moscow is using Hezbollah as a source of information, which is a jihadi group. Is Hezbollah a liberal party?
It's a political parliamentary democratic party in Lebanon, Hezbollah.
Christian, you want to jump? Only a few countries in the world define Hezbollah that way.
Okay, but let me jump in.
This is a different matter.
Let me jump in, Peter.
No, let's talk. That's right. Christian, please do.
Yeah, because this line of debate isn't going to go anywhere. The issue is about Russia-Syria relations. It would be good to know if our guest in Russia has a clear understanding of what the Russian Federation's objectives are with regards to Syria. It's not very clear, actually. I mean, we talk about. They talk about.
I think it's extremely clear. No one wants to. Russia doesn't want to see a catastrophic collapse of the Syrian state.
Okay.
It wants a transition.
Let's follow that. One of the logical paths of this line of debate, where they're saying, "Okay, come to the table." Now, let me just step outside the situation and say, if I was looking at this situation objectively, they are saying to the current regime and to elements in the opposition to sit down at the table. What's the end point? Is it a free election? If it's an election, who's going to administer that? Is it going to be the UN? How is it going to be administered in a safe way where people can organize parties, campaign and vote? Does it need a UN stabilization force? Do the Russians think that the Ba'ath Party and Assad himself would submit themselves to a free election? I suspect their calculation is they couldn't win a free election. That's what I would put back as the challenge.
I think your technical side of it is very interesting, but it's kind of trivial next to a war. Alexander, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yes, I want to add something. It's impossible to make free elections in the country which is in the conditions of the civil war. It's quite impossible.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying if you want to take people to the table, obviously there would need to be a cessation of violence. But what you're doing is, as ever, when somebody pricks the so-called objectives of the Russian Federation, these excuses come up. So what I'm saying is, take the stated Russian objectives to their logical conclusion and test them.
As you know, our Russian foreign minister, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, created a plan of 3 points. The first point is to stop violence in Syria. The second point is to stop interference in the Syrian internal affairs from all the countries, including, at first, the countries of Gulf Cooperation Council, which provide arms the Syrian rebels now. And the third point is the democratic elections. I think that now, in this situation, Syrian government also understands very well that without the participation of Muslim Brotherhood, for example, it's impossible to stop tensions in this country, to reconcile this country.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We have to go to a station identification. This is Voice of Russia, and you're listening to the program Debating Russia. Well, in London, you've been a little quiet there. Do you want to react to something that Alexander said? Go ahead.
I just want to mention that prior to the revolution, Syrian people had always recognized Russia as their friend and ally in their struggle with Israel to recover their occupied territories. And we were very, very shocked by the Russian stance. We weren't expecting Russia to take side of a bloody dictatorship that is continuously killing its people.
But I think you're missing the point. You're missing the point. And the point is, it's called Libya. That's what happened. Forced regime change. And the international community, and Russia's a member of the international community, will not tolerate another forced regime change.
I think the Russian administration is using the Libyan example as an excuse to justify its policy towards Syria. This is a political situation. When the revolution started, we said that this is a political crisis and it needs a political solution. The regime retaliated in violence. It fired live ammunition at peaceful unarmed protesters. Now, after 2 years, the Russians and the Syrian regime are talking about possible political talks between the regime and the opposition. It is too late. Russia is biased. Russia cannot be considered as
what about the Qataris, the Saudis, the Americans, the French, the British? They're not biased here?
They are not, because they are standing beside the people of Syria who are being killed by a bloody and violent regime, by a bunch of criminals that enjoys unlimited support by the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians. This is very, very different. And to be honest, the Americans and the West are not supplying the Syrian people with weapons and ammunition to protect themselves.
But Alexander, please.
My Syrian friend, I would like to ask you, what about the Saudi regime? It is not a bloody regime, for your opinion. The regime which oppresses Muslim
It is not my problem.
The
Saudi people sort it out themselves.
And provide support to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria in the same time. It is not a bloody regime. It's a truly a democratic regime when 5 or 6 people from the ruling family regulate everything.
And what about the Syrian regime? Isn't it a family-run business? Isn't it a mafia-style family-run business, a sectarian core concept of it?
Of course, it was a corrupted regime. And of course,
you have double standards here.
The violations of the human rights, but it is mafia-style regimes. It were everywhere on the Middle East, in Egypt, Mubarak, in Tunisia, and everywhere, and in Iraq also, and in Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries.
My problem is my people.
But the main country is a problem of transition from the mafia-style regime to the democratic regime. If the transition will be on the way on the bloody civil war and of the destruction of everything, as in Syria now, it's a deadlock.
But you are ignoring the fact that it is the regime
your proposal,
which started the civil
for the
war,
deadlock.
Enjoying the unlimited support of the Russians. It is the regime. It is a sectarian regime.
I don't understand what you mean, unlimited support. There are no more arms being shipped there at all. If anything, it's spare parts. There was a delegation here asking for planes. There was no reaction positive whatsoever. There are no direct flights from Moscow to Damascus anymore. Christian, go ahead.
The Syrian authorities surely should be giving some sort of signals that they are genuinely interested in this so-called peaceful transition. They could stop their indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian areas using ballistic missiles, direct attacks, disproportionate attacks. There's some simple, visible signals they could be doing, which they're not doing. The Russians themselves could be insisting on that publicly as well. Of course, there's a lot of back-channel diplomacy going on all the time. But, as our Syrian guest is saying, the Russians, the perception is they are biased because we don't hear them publicly condemning grave violations of international law, crimes against humanity by the Syrian authorities.
No other country that has been pushing harder for a diplomatic solution than Russia. Are you going to agree?
Well, that's a terrible indictment. That's a terrible indictment of the international community.
It's very public too. You don't have to go too far to find out about it.
It's a terrible indictment of the international community.
What's the next regime change after that? Okay, one after another. Okay, I mean, gentlemen, what's the law of unintended consequences? Does it ever really work out very well? Okay, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Does it ever work? Alexander, go ahead.
The main aim of Russia in the Syrian conflict now is not the unconditional support of Assad regime. It is to prevent the interference to the Syrian affairs from the Western countries, from the NATO, and from the Gulf Cooperation Council. We have seen the results of the NATO interference in the Libyan affairs. Is Libya now a true democratic state? It is a state in the condition of the civil war now. The militia of the former rebels, 40,000 or 50,000 people, now they share the country in Libya. And
one of those groups killed the American ambassador there.
Yes, and even they killed the American ambassador. Is that the democratic state? I don't know this.
Well, do you expect it to become democratic in 1 year after 40 years of brutal dictatorship?
And do you expect that Syria will become the true democratic state after Assad will leave power? Or do you expect the Lebanese variant in Syria, the civil war for 14 or 15 years with many crimes and many victims of this war?
Gentlemen, I'd like to ask everyone a question here. Is there a possibility that we could see a partition of Syria? Because it appears, at least right now, that no one's going to win by the use of arms. Christian, you want to field that one? Partition.
I don't know. I mean, if you look at the history of borders over a long enough time in the world, borders are flexible. So we wouldn't have a position on that. Like I said, we'd bring it back to what measures and actions are being taken to protect civilians, and those measures and actions that are being proposed, how will they protect civilians? So your guest in Russia had a good point when he said, look at what's happened in Libya. Absolutely, and Amnesty International said at the time and has said subsequently that going into a country without proper safeguards, human rights protection mechanisms and protocols will have a negative impact on civilians. We're saying the same thing about...
Christian, is that being thought about now?
It is, but it's not being...
circles, do you hear that?
Yes, it is being thought about. It is being thought about, but it's not being done enough. And, we've been very clear and public and vocal, for instance, with the UK Foreign Office, that they should be impressing on those people within the armed opposition and the civilian opposition they have influence with, because they don't have influence with everybody, let's be clear. But those that they do have influence with, is that the key principles of international humanitarian law need to be understood, and, countries that can assist should assist with that. That includes training. There's a loose command structure, which is not good for accountability, so help them with their command structure as well. This is about...
No, but under international law, arming...
I didn't say arming.
International law. You're pushing international law.
I didn't say
That's
arming.
Against international law now.
I didn't say arming. I said insist on international humanitarian law being understood, mainstreamed, monitored within the armed opposition. That's absolutely critical. They are a reality. Let's not pretend that what is called the Free Syrian Army is not a reality. It's a reality. So those countries that are engaged with them and have been engaged with them for some time have a responsibility to impress on them. You have to protect civilians. And this is how you do it. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a sensible thing to be doing.
My question is, partition, is that a possibility? Just a separation of populations?
The risk is there. As I mentioned before, this is a regime that has a strong sectarian element. Well, I think that the regime might think of using this element at some point. We are talking a bunch of people that don't understand the language of politics and certainly don't understand it. They have the mentality of a gang. So it is quite possible that at some point they would retreat to the mountains and the coastal area and try to create their own pocket there and fight their battle from there.
Okay, Alexander?
So, to my mind, the partition of Syria will be the greatest tragedy for this country, because the new DAF states, little states, will be as the puppets in the hands of
regional neighbors.
Of the regional neighbors, yes. The best solution for me is not the partition, but the creation of the greater Syria, so-called Bilad al-Sham, of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. It will be the self-sufficient state in the Middle East.
Okay.
I strongly agree with Alexander. Thank you very much, actually. This would be a dream come true. Thank you very much.
All right, gentlemen, we'll reconvene on that one another time. All right, Christian, and Alexander here in the studio here. Thank you very much for joining me here on Voice of Russia's new political program, Debating Russia. Guest, and then we can do this, gentlemen. Alexander, jump in.
Of course, Syria needs much diplomacy and less arms, because they are providing arms support for the rebels of the so-called Free Syrian Army and of the jihadist group, fuels the religious civil war in Syria. I want to say that Syrian war began as peaceful protests against the dictatorship, but now we have the full-scale religious civil war in this country.
They've been saying that for a long time, and Amnesty International have been saying back to them, what are the safeguards? Are you assessing the risks properly? How will this better protect civilians? It's for those countries that are thinking of potentially arming particular armed groups inside Syria to be able to answer those questions. Those questions haven't been answered adequately yet.
Okay, well, what do you think? More arms or more diplomacy?
Let me be honest with you. Syria is in a state of war. There is a regime that is continuously killing its people and constantly receiving unlimited support.
Hello and welcome to Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. The topic of Russia's foreign policy towards Syria is quite contentious. It gets a lot of criticism in the media. And on this program today, we're going to see if it's justified. Joining me in London is Christian Benedict at Amnesty International. He's the UK campaign manager there. We have Wael Algi. He is a member of the Syrian National Council and Europe director of the Syrian Christians for Democracy organization. And here in the studio with me here in Moscow is Alexander Kuznetsov. He's a vice president of Geo-Arabica Center. Christian, if I can go to you first.
From its allies in Russia and Iran and China. On the other hand, we have people who want to defend themselves, to protect their children, to protect their properties, and they lack everything. They lack food, they lack medicines, they lack ammunition, they lack arms.
You're saying fuel the civil war, fuel the civil war. I'm sorry, but that's what it sounds like.
No, I'm not saying fuel the civil war. It is actually Russia that is fueling the civil war by it is continuous support to the Syrian regime.
Please, let me go to our third. We look at the problems in dealing. It's 2 years now going on, this conflict, this civil war. What does Syria need more of right now? Does it need more diplomacy or does it need more guns?
Ultimately, Syrian civilians need protection. That's where we would like the international community's debate to be in terms of how do they better protect civilians. And that seems to be missing.
Does that mean arming them?
Well,
let's be clear here. Because we have
Sure.
officials in France
Sure.
and in Britain saying they're opening to the idea of not respecting the embargo. Go ahead.
Sure.